Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're delighted to have you with us for today's Nonprofit Navigation Series, hosted by the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. One of our primary goals at the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership and the Nonprofit Navigation Series is to create opportunities for nonprofit leaders and board members, funders, community members to come together and learn from one another and encourage and engage in meaningful conversations about issues shaping our sector. My name is Tom Van Sagi, and I have the privilege of serving as the managing director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. At the center, we're committed to strengthening nonprofit organizations by developing exceptional leaders, advancing effective governance, and fostering collaboration across the Kansas City community. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Mike English, Chief Executive Officer at the Moran Company. Mike has devoted more than 2 decades to strengthening nonprofit organizations and helping them navigate one of the most important decisions they'll ever make, selecting their executive leaders. Since joining the Moran Company in 2020, as a search consultant and now serving as CEO, Mike has led executive searches for CEOs, CFOs, COOs, and other senior leaders across a wide range of nonprofit organizations, including community foundations, educational institutions, affordable housing organizations, mental health providers, developmental disability organizations, and human service agencies throughout the country. What makes Mike's perspective especially valuable is that he understands nonprofit leadership from both sides of the table. Before joining the Moran Company, he served as the founding executive director of Turn the Page KC, where he partnered with former Kansas City Mayor Sly James to transform a mayoral initiative into a nationally recognized organization dedicated to improving third-grade reading outcomes for children across our community. Mike earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and his master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. He also continues to give back to the nonprofit sector through his service on the board of directors of the Network of Nonprofit Search Consultants and as treasurer of the Parent Leadership Training Institute, Kansas City. Today's session, How Nonprofits Can Attract and Hire Exceptional Leaders in Today's Market, draws on Mike's extensive experience conducting executive searches across the country. He'll share practical insights into what today's top nonprofit candidates are looking for, why some organizations attract exceptional candidates while others struggle, and what nonprofit boards and executive teams can do to position themselves as employers of choice in an increasingly competitive marketplace. Mike's going to speak for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for questions and discussions. As you listen, I encourage you to think about questions you may want to ask. Some of the richest learning during these sessions comes from the conversation we have together. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mike English.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's great to see so many people during the summer continuing to join these navigation series, which I love. I love being a participant, so it's kind of an honor to be a presenter. Just a quick note about the Moran Company. So we are an executive search firm started by Bill Moran, and so we're a local Kansas City firm, and we conduct executive searches for really all leadership positions, executive directors, CEOs, development directors, COOs, CFOs. And so as I'm talking, just keep in mind that those are typically the types of positions that I have experience in recruiting for. So just to give you some context there. So just a little bit about me. If I could advance the slide here. Oh, okay, gotcha.
No, the arrow on the keyboard.
Oh,
there you go.
So as Tom said, my background is in nonprofit leadership. So I spent about 20 years as a nonprofit executive director. I spent some time in Pennsylvania, where I grew up as a nonprofit AD, and then here in Kansas City, and also worked at the Kauffman Foundation for a few years. But I also want to mention I'm this network of nonprofit search consultants. This is kind of an association of search firms that work exclusively with nonprofits, and so there are about 40 or 50 firms like us in this association. I'm on the board. So I mentioned that just because I get to hear a lot about trends in other cities as well from other members of that association. So the current demand for nonprofit leaders is kind of where I wanted to start. So this is kind of an interesting trend that I've seen recently. So if you recall back in 2020 when COVID started, that next year, 2020, 2021, there were the nonprofit sector was really stretched, of course. And what we were experiencing at the Moran Company is that people were not leaving, although that it started this great resignation that wasn't really hitting the nonprofit leadership until about 2022. So what we saw in 2022 was a huge demand for search services. Lots and lots of organizations looking to hire different leadership positions. What we're seeing now it reminds me of that. So, and I think that in so when Trump was elected, so that first year, as you probably remember, Doge was kind of running rampant through the federal government and it was having a huge impact on nonprofit organizations. And so that first year, our firm wasn't that busy. So we were seeing a lot of nonprofit leaders not wanting to leave. And I think says a lot about, I think, nonprofit leaders. They don't want to leave their organization really for two reasons, probably during a time like that. First, it's they don't want to leave their organization in a lurch when funding is so tight. And then also the job market's not great at a time like that. But then what happens is that eventually there's kind of this unfreezing. So then about 12 to 18 months after all of that, we start to see a huge increase in the number of kind of searches for leadership positions in the nonprofit sector. And so a firm like ours gets very busy right now because there are a lot of people leaving their nonprofit leadership positions. And so there's a huge demand, lots of opportunity for job seekers. So these are kind of conscientious nonprofit leaders. They don't want to leave during a crisis, but that crisis also burns them out. So there's this report that came out a few months ago, from the Center for Nonprofit Excellence called the State of Nonprofits 2026. And kind of one of the major themes was just about leadership burnout. So 46% of nonprofit CEOs reported their own burnout was a major concern. And you can see how big a jump that was. And then also 25% said that burnout was significantly impacting their staff. 45% thought that staff recruitment and retention was one of their biggest organizational challenges. So all of that just to kind of lay the groundwork for this presentation, which is to say that they're currently hiring is a challenge because there's lots of turnover at this point. And so what I wanted to kind of talk to you about was a good process for recruiting and hiring nonprofit leaders. And I'm going to kind of use our process at the Moran Company as the framework for this, and then kind of fill in some of the details for you just to give some really tips. And I'm assuming that many of you are on nonprofit boards or nonprofit staff, have a affinity for the sector, and so at whatever level you're involved with hiring a nonprofit leader, this may be some of these tips may be applicable. So our firm, we have typically a 12 to 14 week process for hiring somebody. And so if we're brought in, if it's a development director or an executive director, really regardless of the position, we have a pretty standard 12 to 14 week process that has 3 phases. And each of these phases kind of is key to hiring, not just finding and attracting people, but making sure you're making the right decision about who to hire. So when we start with this orientation and assessment phase. We really get to know the organization. We spend about 6 weeks recruiting and then go through an interview process at the end. So the first part of this is this orientation and assessment phase. So in this early part of a search. So what we're trying to do is really understand what's going on at the organization. Before we start recruiting, we want to make sure that we're finding the right person. And what I wanted to just note here is that this is kind of where, as you're thinking about your own organization, before you start recruiting for that position, just being really clear about what's going on. And so, particularly as a board member, sometimes as board members, we are not completely aware of everything going on within the organization. And so, what I like to do is to go into an organization and meet with as many staff as I can, one-on-one, confidentially, and just talk through, what they do, and also what do they see as maybe the challenges facing the organization. And so then as I walk away, I have a better understanding. And also we can do some focus group and survey work as well to make sure that we're gathering kind of anonymous feedback from people. So sometimes I'll go in and sit down with the outgoing executive director, spend about an hour, and it sounds like everything's great. Like they're gonna really be, he doesn't know how they'll go on without. And then I meet with staff and start to learn there's a lot of gaps that need to be filled, and that maybe this outgoing CEO or executive director wasn't as the picture wasn't as rosy as he's presenting it. So if you're on a board before you start the search, I would recommend trying to sit down with key staff just to make sure you understand everything going on with the organization. So this also kind of leads into what candidates are looking for in a nonprofit. So as you're kind of assessing the state of the organization, one thing to kind of keep in mind is that candidates typically are looking for stable finances, stable funding. Really, the most important part here, though, is the cash reserves. That's what really, I think, for a lot of candidates makes the job more appealing. So maybe you had a tough year last year and you had a loss. Maybe it's been a couple of years. That's not going to necessarily scare away great candidates. I think as long as they know that if they come in and don't have to immediately make major cuts or immediately raise funds, they'll feel a good candidate will feel confident that they can kind of turn things around as long as they have a ample runway to do so. And then also, I don't think that your challenges or your problems are going to scare good candidates. So what I've found in my recruiting experience is that strong leaders, they're not afraid of turmoil. And in fact, some real good candidates, they'll see this as an upside or an opportunity. So for example, I was leading a search for a CEO of a United Way affiliate, not here in Kansas City, another state, and they were having a tough time. So they had a real challenging couple of years. Their annual campaign was down, lots of staff turnover, and the whole community knew it. And so they were very wary. They didn't think they were going to get a lot of strong local candidates. But what we found is that we actually had a lot of really good local candidates because they saw it as an opportunity and they thought that this is something where they could really make their mark locally. So the third thing that candidates are looking for, especially in these executive director positions, are boards that are truly governing boards or at least committed to becoming a governing board. So especially experienced executive director candidates, they don't want to walk into a situation where the board is very hands-on and kind of really in the weeds. That being said, a lot of times that's what's necessary, right? So if your nonprofit is still in the first 5-7 years of its existence, sometimes you really do need the board to be very involved. And then likewise, if you're going through a lot of turmoil, maybe the executive director was let go, maybe the person quit suddenly. Oftentimes that's the case where you need the board to really jump in and get involved. But I think as you're trying to recruit candidates, what they're really looking for is that commitment to get back to being a governing board. And so as you're talking to candidates as board members, just expressing your hope, and that's probably a hope you have as a board member, is that you'll get back to being a governing board. And then finally, just a kind of a side note about what candidates are looking for is that in my experience, I've found that when a founder of a nonprofit or a very long-term executive director, and I'm talking 20, 30 years, when those people decide to retire, that's not as appealing as a job as one might think. And so what I think is often a good idea that I've seen a lot of nonprofits do is to hire an interim. It's kind of that transitionary person, so that's 6 months or so, for a couple of reasons. One, nobody wants to succeed the founder. It's just so much of the organization is built up in that person's mind and their personality. So it's just a hard job to do that. But then also, if the same person has been sort of in charge for so long, there can just be a lot of things that are sort of maybe not running as operationally smoothly as you'd like as an incoming executive director. And so an interim can be helpful coming in, sort of maybe modernizing or shoring up some processes and just being that buffer in between the long-term person and the next executive director. So then once you kind of understand, what the state is of the organization, and maybe if it's a development position and you kind of understand what's going on in the development department, you're kind of ready to start recruiting and posting the position. So I mentioned at the start that our firm spends 6 weeks recruiting. And so what we like to do is post the position and then set a date for the closeout of applications. And then during that period, post the position and do a lot of active recruiting. So when we are recruiting, we think of potential candidates as either active or passive candidates. So the active job candidates, these are people that are, they've decided that they want a new job, or maybe they lost their job and they're in the job market. They are actively looking at job boards, actively networking. But then there are passive candidates. So these are people that may not really be looking for a new job, but oftentimes these are great candidates. And so that recruiting can take some time because you're trying to figure out and uncover who these people are and then recruit them. So as we are recruiting, what we do is we set a window of about 6 weeks. By the end of that, we get a lot of applicants, and then we start basically that process of narrowing it down. So evaluating all the candidates, deciding first a group to interview, and usually we start with about 20 people to interview, depending on the candidate pool, and then we narrow it down from there. Usually about 3 rounds of interviews. But I wanted to just give you a few just kind of recruiting tips here as you're thinking about this. The first thing is to just know that the candidates now, and this is in my experience in the last few years, they expect more, and so there was a time, I think right after 2022, 2023, we were seeing most positions be remote or hybrid. And then we've kind of gone back to the office. A lot of people have, but job candidates kind of people got a taste for that in the nonprofit sector. And so we're seeing, as we post positions and talk to candidates, that people may not necessarily demand or want fully remote positions, but there is some expectation of more workplace flexibility. And so to whatever extent you can, and I understand it's not possible in a lot of nonprofits, but to whatever extent you can to have some flexibility, hybrid environment, that'll make the position more attractive. And then, so the other part of this is that candidates are expecting more competitive compensation. So and benchmark kind of with broader market. And I'm going to mention a little bit later about how to kind of figure out what the right salary range is for a position. But this can be sometimes a little touchy because if you have somebody who is leaving or has left that everybody liked, and then you're trying to hire their replacement, and all of a sudden you're posting a much higher salary, that can kind of rub people the wrong way. So it gets tricky, but it is good to keep in mind that in today's environment where there are a lot of opportunities for nonprofit leaders, compensation is becoming more competitive, and candidates are becoming more picky. So then because of this and because of the competitive hiring environment, it's takes a lot more work to recruit. And so I say it's not, you can't just post the position and pray that you get good candidates, because you might, but you really need to spend time networking and recruiting in order to find really strong candidates. And so I'll kind of walk you through what we like to do is it's kind of an intentional structured recruiting process in order to kind of attract really strong applicants for a position. So first of all, I'd like to talk just a minute about prospect researching. So once you have decided what the job is and you have written the job description and the position profile, you kind of know exactly what you're looking for. And so there are some different ways you can then start to get the word out. You'll obviously post the position, but then as I mentioned, you want to start doing this outreach. And as I'm doing recruiting, what I like to do, one of the ways I like to start, especially if I'm in a community where I don't live, is to essentially figure out what is the nonprofits, what other nonprofits are in that area, what are the nonprofits with similar missions, similar size, and then kind of focus some recruiting efforts there. And so this used to take lots and lots of time. AI has made this a lot easier. So what I like to do is basically use we use a Google Workspace environment, so we'll use Google Gemini and use a deep research feature and upload the position profile and then provide some prompts to ask Gemini to help find and suggest good candidates for the position. And you can even ask it to provide contact information, and sometimes it'll have it, sometimes it won't. But this can really help you develop and I typically start with kind of a spreadsheet of people that may be good, either candidates for the job or good connectors in the area. So that's just a good way to build your prospect list. One thing to be aware of while recruiting, and this is getting to be so annoying, is these kind of impersonators. And you may get these messages sometimes, but as you're recruiting, just be aware, even if you're not a recruiter, even if you work as a board member, we've started to see people impersonate board members as well, or even HR people. And so we will get contacted by somebody showing us the message, the email they've received from a board member, and they've basically taken their picture and their contact information off the website, put it in a signature line so it looks completely legitimate. But where they kind of give themselves away is typically their email address is a weird email or a Gmail or something. So this is just something as you're recruiting, it just makes that kind of direct outreach and making yourself sound like a human even more important as you're recruiting. And so using the telephone sometimes is a good way to get around this. And then the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about as I'm talking about AI and some of this in recruiting is just being aware that as people apply for jobs, they are using AI as well. And I'm sure many of you have seen this. And so what we tend to notice is that job candidates will use AI for, I think, some really appropriate ways. Some ways that are less appropriate. Some of the appropriate ways I think that candidates are using it is to research the organization, get a really good idea of what the organization does and what the position they're applying for does. They will start to use it to help customize their resume, which I have no problem with. So if you're in the job market and you're applying for, you need a job, so you're applying for 10, 15 jobs, it is very onerous, as I'm sure a lot of you have gone through, of trying to customize your resume for each specific job. But I've noticed a lot of candidates are using AI to help them do that very quickly, and also customize cover letters. And so what we're kind of looking for, I mean, personally, it doesn't bother me when people do this, but we're trying to look for the person behind that cover letter. And so good cover letters, as people are applying for jobs, they provide some personal context or personal passion for the reason that, that AI may not be aware of. So, well, that was the last thing I'll mention about AI. Okay, so as I'm recruiting, I spend a ton of time on LinkedIn. It's still, I think, the best way to find good candidates for jobs. And so many of you have probably seen, though, that LinkedIn, I say it flatters individuals by targeting them with specific job postings. So I'll hear from candidates that say, LinkedIn told me this, that I'm a top candidate for this job. And they may be, but also LinkedIn's telling lots of people that same thing. So, oops. Hit the wrong. So, and the other thing about LinkedIn is sometimes it takes liberties with your job posting. So, if your organization wants to post a job on LinkedIn, I encourage you to definitely include a salary range, because if you don't, LinkedIn will provide it for you. And so it'll make assumptions, and it's usually wrong, and that can create a lot of problems. So just be aware of that as you're posting on LinkedIn. But it's still the best way to find and reach out to candidates. So if we have a job posted and say we get 100 candidates, I would say 50% of them heard about it through LinkedIn. And so using it to post the position and then do outreach is very effective. So while you're doing outreach on LinkedIn, here's kind of the way I kind of approach it. So let's say you're working for a CFO for your nonprofit in Kansas City. You go into LinkedIn and you kind of do that thing where you search for people, and you can search for a position type or search for people with these kind of keywords like CFO, controller, finance manager, and then it'll bring back a ton of results. And then basically what you're doing is then using some of those filters to kind of narrow it down to individuals that may be more appropriate for the job. And so once you get to kind of if you're seeing the right results, like these are people on LinkedIn that seem like they might be a good fit for the job, what I recommend is then connecting with them. So if you send them a connection request and provide if you add a note and just kind of let them know why you're asking to connect with them, they're more likely to accept your connection request. And then if they do, once you're connected, you can find their email address. And so you probably, maybe you've noticed this from people like me, where like a recruiter maybe tries to connect with you or sends you a message on LinkedIn, and then a few days later you get an email address, maybe your personal email address. That's because this is kind of how we do it. We kind of find a person. So here's a person that who was, I think, maybe a good fit for a specific job I was recruiting for, connected with her. And then as you can see, then I can click on that contact info and then get that email address. And so then follow up with that email. And the nice thing about doing it this way too, is that a lot of people, their email address associated with their LinkedIn account is their personal email address, which is kind of a nicer way to recruit somebody, to send it to their personal rather than to their work email address. Some people feel uncomfortable corresponding about a future job while using the email address for their current job. And then job boards. So we do post the positions on job boards, and we do track like what job boards are effective. And so here in Kansas City, the Nonprofit Connect job board is very, very effective. Just a few others I'll mention too. The Indeed and Idealist are still very effective. The percentage of strong candidates you get from an Indeed and an Idealist is lower, but you're going to get a lot of candidates, so you'll have to sift through more resumes, but you'll still find some good candidates through those job boards. There's a job board that I like called execsearches.com, which is a place where we find a lot of kind of nonprofit executives. The Rome Group is a job board in St. Louis. And because St. Louis and Kansas City have so many similarities and we're not that far away, a lot of people kind of look at those job boards too. And then you're depending on what your mission is for your nonprofit, you may find some industry job boards. So for example, if your organization works on mental health, there's national associations and they have job boards. Some of those tend to be more expensive, um, but you'll typically get some strong candidates. And so uh, these job boards cost money, and so just be prepared to spend a little money. I would say, when we're doing a search, we spend probably 1,000 to 1,500 on job postings, and that's because we're doing it for 6 weeks and on a number of kind of targeted job boards. And you want to just be obviously you're going to be prudent with your own money, so just trying to find the job boards that are most appropriate for the position you're recruiting for. It can be very helpful. And then I mentioned these kind of passive job candidates before. So finding them, the best way we find it is to connect with people. So what I call them resource people. And so, and if you're on this webinar, you may be one of these resource people, and I may have called you before. And so these are people like Tom here, right? So people who are well connected in the nonprofit community and very friendly and willing to have conversations and make connections. And so I try not to be too annoying to these people, because I assume it's annoying to get calls from me saying, who do you know that's in this sector all the time? And so each time I'm doing a search or each time you're hiring, just think carefully about a list of people to start calling to get suggestions. And one thing, if you've been called by somebody, doing what I'm talking about before, you may not be able to think of anybody. So you may get a call and say, or I'm on a board, we're trying to hire an executive director. Do you know anybody? And you may just, you know, can't think of anybody. So what's helpful is what I like to do is get on a Zoom with the person and connect with them on LinkedIn if we're not already. And then I'll pull up their LinkedIn profile, share my screen with them. And then you know how you can see connections. I'll click on their connections, and then we'll just scroll down. And so they may have 1,000 connections. So you may have to filter it in order to get to a manageable level. But then what we just kind of do is they kind of scroll through, and then they'll see names and they'll say, oh, that person would be great, or that person knows a lot of people. And so as we're doing that, I'm just writing down these names, and it kind of like a spider web kind of goes from there. So I wanted to mention searches. So as we're recruiting, for a job, depending on the job and the location and the salary, we may get 5 applicants and we may get 500. And so wanted to just sort of mention a few things that are obvious and a few things that maybe aren't, about what jobs generate a lot of applicants. So the first is remote positions. So our searches for remote positions, we see about 2 or 3 times the number of applicants. That just goes back to that desire a lot of people have for workplace flexibility. And then also there aren't the geographical constraints there might be. Competitive salary. So this one's obvious. If you have a huge salary, you're going to get a lot of people interested in the job. So what I wanted to mention is about how you can figure out what a competitive salary is for the job. So if you're working on, say you're on a board and you're looking for an executive director or maybe a CFO or a COO or even like the highest fundraising position, you can go on Candid, GuideStar, was it ProPublica, and you can find 990s for nonprofits. And as you scroll through the 990, you'll get to the point where you see the salaries of the highest paid employees of that nonprofit organization. And a lot of you have probably done this before. And actually, it's a good idea to do if you're looking for a job. Just you can figure out what they're paying before you get too far along in the process. But what I like to do is if I'm recruiting for a specific, let's say it's a executive director role, I figure out what are the organizations that are most similar to this one in the same geographic area, and then just put together a kind of a table listing those organizations in the salary of their highest paid employee. And so you'll start to see you'll start to get kind of a sense of what range you need to be in. And then just make sure you adjust it for inflation, because as you know, those 990s are typically a little old. But then you'll have your data, and then you can figure out, okay, what is the salary range we can afford, and then also be competitive in the marketplace. So once you go to the market with a salary range that's competitive, it's going to attract more applicants. The other thing that you can do too is if you go to, Nonprofit Connect has all these jobs posted, and or organizations like that. Most jobs now on postings have the salary ranges, so you can get kind of a flavor for what ranges are out there in current job vacancies. And then the next thing is that generates a lot of applicants is creating a buzz about the opportunity. So sometimes it makes sense to actually send out a press release. And if it gets picked up by somebody, I've seen this really generates a lot of interest. And then finding lots of people who are willing to share it on social media, specifically LinkedIn and Facebook. So a good way to do this is to, if you've posted the job on LinkedIn, you share it, your organization maybe shares it, maybe you share it personally. And then I like to a lot of people who I think are helpful people, maybe with a lot of connections, I like to send them a link via email and just say, hey, would you be willing to share this on your LinkedIn profile? And so if 5 or 10 well-connected people do that, all of a sudden the number of people seeing this job posting is huge. And so then it creates a lot more buzz and we get a lot more applicants. And then the last thing that's hard to control is just the brand awareness of the nonprofit. So nonprofits with names that are known and respected in the community, it's typically generate a lot more applicants for different positions. And then finally, after all that recruiting, hopefully you've gotten a nice, big, diverse portfolio of job candidates. And so then it's time to start kind of finding the best match. And so just wanted to spend a couple minutes walking through how we do that. So basically, the first thing I like to say is just be very transparent about the position as you start to interviewing people. Because if you're not, and like there's problems and they don't find out about them until the very end, you can lose them at the end, which kind of creates a problem. So just be honest with them about challenges. So you can bring this up during interviews. Just say, as I mentioned before, good candidates aren't afraid of some challenges. So just be clear about what those are, and then be very clear the whole time about what the salary range is. Nothing worse to getting to the very end, you fall in love with a candidate, offer them the job, and they say they need $40,000 more than you're able to pay. And also just about relocation expenses if that's applicable, and then the benefits if you can. So I recommend having kind of a benefit sheet ready. So as you get through the interview process and people ask about health insurance or retirement plans, you have something you can send to them easily. So this just helps you. It helps you because you're getting that information to them before it's kind of too late in the process. And then the visibility of staff, board, and the office. So something that's always found kind of weird with my own career as well is like you would interview for a job in nonprofit executive directors positions in particular, kind of like this. But you may be interviewing with the board, and maybe the interview is at the law firm conference room of one of the board members, and you meet the board and you interview with them, and then you get offered the job, and you're expected to make a decision, and you've never met the staff, you've never even seen the office where you would work. So I feel like the interview process is as you get to the very end, just don't forget to make sure that as part of that process, if possible, the candidates you really like or have an opportunity to kind of meet the staff and see where they would work. And so just again, to make sure that they don't kind of bail out at the very end. And then finally, you have a resume, you have a cover letter, but then as you get to the final stage, there's a couple of things that you can do to kind of go beyond the resume. So one thing that a lot of boards like to do when they're hiring an executive director is figure out a way to get to know them informally. So that may be, a few of them taking the candidate out to dinner. And if maybe you've narrowed it down to 2 or 3, there may be a lunch with one, a dinner with another, the third day, to really kind of get to know them. Because this is, if you're hiring this person, you're going to be spending a lot of time with them, and so you want to kind of get a feel for what they're like, less formal environment. But then you want to see what they're like in a formal environment. So, in addition to the formal interview, a lot of my clients tend to have like a presentation or a performance task where prior to the interview, they may ask their favorite two candidates each to kind of prepare a presentation on a specific topic. And so they can see basically their analytical skills and their presentation skills. Because these are two things that they're going to be doing a lot of the job. So they kind of want to see how they perform. I just caution you not to go overboard, right? So these are people, they're not on your payroll yet. So you can't ask them to like create a business plan for the organization. It's got to be something they can, I always say, something they can prepare in an hour or 2 hours. So just good way to scheme an action though. And then the other way is reference checks. I feel like when people hire for different positions, a lot of times we see reference checks as kind of a check the box thing. But they're really good way to learn and validate a lot of things about these candidates. And so as I go into a reference check, I usually have a couple of very specific things I want to find out. And so maybe it's something that the person said in an interview that I want to find out, is that actually true, or are they exaggerating? Or I want to find out about how they handled a specific situation. And so, I shy away from that kind of interview question or that reference check question where you're like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate them here? I like to go into very specific things and then uh, and then basically find out from these references what it was like, what the experience was like working with that person. And then personality assessments. So I applied for a job one time where there was a psychologist who gave me this personality test assessment that took about half a day, and they used it to determine whether to make the offer. And I think that there are companies and nonprofits that do that. But we do use personality assessments, but really only as a guide for our interviews. So we'll administer an assessment to a good candidate and then look at the results and use those to help shape interview questions, not as a way to kind of weed people out. Because, the biggest introvert could be the most effective executive director. It doesn't, that shouldn't be kind of a screening process, but it can help with helping to shape the conversation with the candidates. Okay, that's it. I think I made it in the 40 minutes, so I will stop there and open it up to questions.
Okay, well, we have so far not received any questions, but I can get started with one that I have. I'm just curious about the current state of the economy and the job market. I just checked. It looks like our national unemployment rate is about 4.2%, which I know is up from where it was a year or so ago. But I just know anecdotally, a lot of people that I know that are maybe looking for new jobs. My sense is that the job market has tightened up, and then especially like executive director or CEO roles are a little bit more plentiful. But you mentioned that that there is a lot going on right now. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about kind of the macro economy.
Yeah, I think that the nonprofit economy, especially for executive director jobs, typically lags a little bit behind the private sector. And so the job market, it may be a year later or so where we see it's tight in the nonprofit sector and then starts to unfreeze a little bit. And so, and I mentioned it before, but there's like these economic crises that happen in the economy. And it's not a political thing to say, but like Trump and Doge, I mean, that was a crisis for nonprofits. It really created a funding problem. So, for example, Medicaid funding, all these nonprofits that rely on Medicaid funding, that a lot of that sort of work by Doge, it created something down the horizon that's going to be a major issue funding wise. And so then what happens is it tightens up. So this crisis happens and then people aren't leaving because, like I said before, they're conscientious, but also they're afraid they won't have anywhere to go. And so eventually you can't tighten up forever. So then eventually people start to leave. So I think right now is when we're starting to see the job market in the nonprofit sector kind of loosen up. So more jobs available, but also more competition for the jobs.
Okay, got it. That kind of helps me understand a little bit more about the broader context, I guess. So, I guess I'm interested in, you are obviously with, you're the lead at the Moran Company. I mean, can you say anything about when is it appropriate to hire a search firm versus doing it in-house? I mean, would you have any thoughts? I mean, obviously you would say hire a search firm every time.
Yeah.
But when would that be better or appropriate versus not, or what are the advantages to going with the search firm?
Yeah, so a couple of reasons that I think it makes a lot of sense to hire a search firm is the first one is that it's just a lot of work. And so if your HR person or your board is stretched, then like any service, outsourcing to a firm to help you do that just makes it'll take a ton of work off your plate. So that's the first reason. The second reason I think it makes sense to hire a firm to help you with this process is when the position you're recruiting for is challenging to find good candidates. And so a lot of the organizations we work with have tried to post it on their own, and maybe they've only received a handful of candidates and they weren't really the right fit. And so if it looks like it may be a challenge to find good candidates for that position, recruiting firms can help because we have, first of all, a huge network, but then also somebody dedicated and spending their time on the recruiting. And then the third reason I think a lot of times it makes sense is when there is, maybe it's a high profile position or an executive director, and you're going to have 1, 2, 3 internal candidates. A search firm can be very helpful because they bring in sort of legitimacy to the process. So even if you have a really strong internal candidate, if there's more than one, especially, you want everybody to think it was fair, to see it was fair, and a firm can really help there because it's an outside firm, and the part of the process is kind of treating everybody with equally with respect. And so bringing it in for credit, a firm in for credibility is kind of a third reason it makes sense. Sometimes it may not, when it's not necessary, I think, is when maybe you have an obvious kind of successor. And so that's an internal candidate where that person's been kind of prepared for the position, and it's bringing a firm may not make sense there. And then just if finances are tight, because it is expensive to hire a firm to do that work. So.
Great. Well, we have a question from the audience.
They're wondering, can this also be applied to succession planning? So obviously we didn't talk about why you're hiring, but how does the succession planning fit into this?
Yes, great question. Yeah, so often the search for the successor is part of that succession plan. So as somebody, if you're lucky enough to have somebody who's leaving who is making everybody aware and planning for that transition, then you can create a succession plan. And I think I've got one of our resources on our website, there's a blog with kind of a toolkit on succession planning. And so as part of the succession plan, often one of the first parts of that is determining if there is somebody internally who's the natural successor. And then if that person is, then that succession plan becomes ultimately kind of a transition plan. So that person is interested, and everybody's very excited about them becoming the next leader. And so then there's that kind of job shadowing and training that takes place with that individual. So that's a key part of the succession plan. But during that first part of that succession plan, you may figure out that no, we don't have anybody internally for the position. And so then the next decision point is, do we have the capacity to manage the search ourselves, or do we bring in a firm for that? So then if you determine the latter, then your search firm or your search partner or consultant can really be a good partner in the execution of the rest of that succession plan. And so, because the process can take 3 months, it really becomes a key part of that succession plan. The other thing I'll mention too is that there's a lot of communications that have to happen here, and oftentimes it's, let's say your executive director comes to the board one meeting and says, "Look, I can only do this for another 8 months." And so then, what I would recommend you do is have the board set up kind of a transition committee. And so then that committee meets with that outgoing ED and starts working on that succession plan. And then part of that should be kind of a communications strategy. So you don't necessarily want your outgoing person to become a real lame duck for too long, because that can affect kind of staff performance or behavior, but also funding decisions. You worry about that as well. And so we like to kind of align the launch of a search with the announcement that the person is leaving. So as you're going through that succession plan, maybe you notify staff and the board, ask them to keep it confidential. And then once you're ready to start the process of looking for the next person, start it with the communication that your current leader has made the decision to transition out. So that's kind of a luxury if you have that much time. Sometimes you don't, a lot of times you don't. So if the outgoing CEO says, "Hey, I've just been offered this job and I have to start in 2 weeks," then your succession plan is a lot more urgent and more of an emergency. And so then you kind of hastily get your board together, notify staff, and then the decision maybe you may need to think about an interim. So often the interim is in some cases it's a board member who maybe has the time and can step in as the executive director for a couple of months, or it's a staff member. And in my experience, it's ideal if that staff member is not going to be a candidate for the position. So, but maybe it's your CFO and they say, "I'm not interested in the job, but I can kind of hold down the fort for a few months." And then the final thing is there are some really good sort of professional interims out there. And you've probably run across some of these folks here in Kansas City that, and actually being an interim is pretty fun. I've done it before too. It's like you're sort of dating the organization, you're not married to them. So you can, and so while you're the interim, some people really like the change management aspect of it, but others are kind of a calming force. And so an interim can be if you hire an external person to be the interim, maybe it's 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week, but they can kind of come in and kind of keep everything together, be the liaison to the board. And then when we're doing a search, that kind of person is always a good connection for us as we're doing a search. So all things to think about when doing a succession plan.
Great. Any more questions? Well, I know I can ask one final question.
Yeah.
I know, having worked with you and Bill over the last 6-8 months, you shared with me one of the things I think is really cool about something you do is the kind of the post. Once the search is done, you guys offer like some coaching for new executive directors, new leaders, and it's kind of a group. I think that's an interest. I don't know, you kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we work with a guy many people may know, a guy named Bruce Scott, longtime kind of nonprofit leader in Kansas City. And Bruce is an executive coach. So a few years ago, we started to kind of provide essentially a scholarship for the people that are placed by us to join an executive coaching program with Bruce. So the leaders that are placed by our organization are then enrolled in an executive coaching program where they meet once a month as a group to sort of discuss different aspects of being an executive director, kind of a safe space for sharing challenges, because these people are really from all over the country. And so, it's a nice place for them to kind of get advice from others on how to solve specific problems. So the role of executive director in particular is very overwhelming in the first 6 months. And, and I've done this a few times, so I can appreciate it. That first month is actually it's pretty fun. It's kind of great. It's kind of that honeymoon period. And people are kind of like nice to you and not being too demanding. And then it's shockingly how fast you go from being the new person to being the person everybody wants something from. And so that next 5 months can be very overwhelming. So it's nice to have kind of a coach to kind of help you through specific challenges like, how do I assess our programs? How do I know what programs are working? Another topic is, how do I get along with my board of directors better? How do I fundraise better? What are some good tips for managing staff, managing maybe difficult staff relationships? And then the final thing that I think is great that Bruce does in his program is he administers a leadership assessment. So the DISC for leaders assessment. And so it's something that can really help the executive director appreciate their own style. And one of the things I would urge anybody taking on a new executive director role is to be very self-aware of your own leadership style, and then also understand your predecessor's leadership style, because the people that work with you are likely reacting to how you're different from the previous person. And that may be all good, all in good ways, but it could be in challenging ways. So it may be that your predecessor was very, very hands-on and you're not. And so knowing that will help you kind of understand better why people seem to be coming and asking for permission for everything that they do. And then the final thing that doesn't happen in this coaching program, but that a lot of highly effective nonprofits will do, is administer an assessment like that to their kind of leadership team. And many of you have probably been a part of something like this, where then all of a sudden you kind of know your own leadership style, but you kind of know the personality of everybody else as well. And so you kind of understand a little bit better about why people are acting the way that they are, and how they may be reacting to you in certain ways. It's better informed by that process.
Where can people learn more about this? Go to your website. What should they look for there? Learn more about the coaching program.
About the coaching program. Yes, we have some blogs on our website with more information about the coaching program.
Okay.
Yep.
I don't know if there's questions for you symbiotically, but you have some messages there.
What?
You shot.
Oh, and this one.
Yeah.
Let me stop this.
No.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, we are just about out of time. One final question, Mike, is just, I think I really appreciate how open you've been about, the impact of the current administration and DOGE and how much stress that placed on the nonprofit sector. I'm a little curious about, the administration has obviously de-emphasized DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I know the nonprofit sector is so committed to diversity and appreciating and lifting up people of color for leadership positions. I'm just curious, have you noticed any de-emphasis on that in the last year or so? Or, I mean, I just know I've been a part of searches where it's a priority to ensure that the leader of an organization reflects the population that it serves. But any sort of thoughts about anything you've noticed recently?
Yes, I would say that definitely has de-emphasized. De-emphasized for sure.
Okay.
I think things are turning a little bit now, but that let's see, when was that 2025?
When the Trump administration took office,
Yeah.
it was January of 25. Yeah.
So that first 6 months, it went from where nonprofits would, when we get searches with nonprofits, we go through an interview process kind of like everybody else, and so we submit proposals. And your firm's kind of commitment to and implementation of DEI practices was always very important, and in fact, often the primary decision making reason for selecting one firm over another. But last year we saw that completely disappear.
Interesting.
And so and the reason is not that nonprofits aren't still committed to it, but the fear of funding loss is so severe, especially in higher education.
Right.
We don't work in higher education much. Saw it there quite a bit, but then really any nonprofit that relies on any sort of federal funding.
Okay.
So it became it sort of just was something that, and I noticed people starting to use the words instead of the letters, which is sort of a silly distinction, but it was almost like they were afraid to say DEI, and so we would talk more about equity and inclusiveness in the search process. So I don't think it's not a priority for nonprofits, but I think that there's also a trepidation about how it could impact their money.
Well, that makes sense. And we've seen that in higher education, and obviously a lot of corporations have really backed off.
Yep.
So it's interesting. I didn't know how nonprofits that you've worked with, but it did show up.
I do think it's changing now.
Yeah.
I see it more. In fact, I'm working with a client right now, and it is a major priority. And so I think that there's, basically like some of this stuff, Trump loses steam after a while, and so I feel like some nonprofits are starting to think, well, okay, we've kind of weathered the worst of it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's
fear in society.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Well, Mike, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
It's been great to have you here this morning, and I hope that the audience has gained from this. But thank you for spending an hour of your time this morning.
Pleasure.
So, and I know we'll be back. We have more navigation sessions planned in 2 weeks, maybe 2 weeks from today. So stay tuned for more nonprofit navigation sessions. Thank you all for attending.